Thanks so much, Bing, and welcome everyone to the Rise of Emerging AAPI Talent, Making Connections and Building Community. My name is Adrian Kwok. I'm an associate partner at McKinsey, and I'm also a member of Asia Society's Global Talent and Diversity Council. In just a moment, I'm going to ask our three fantastic panelists to introduce themselves. But before I do that, I just want to make an invitation to all of you to submit your questions during this session. I have some that I've prepared that I'll lead through for the first half, but my hope is that about 20 minutes in, we'll start taking questions from all of you and turn this into much more of a conversation. And this session should wrap promptly at 2:17 Eastern. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to our panelists to do an introduction. Jessica Lee, Jessica Kung, and Ngoc-Vu Nguyen. And Jessica Lee, why don't you go first?
Thank you. Hi, everyone. So glad to be with you, Jessica Lee, and I work for travel company Marriott International, where I have the amazing opportunity to be a Senior Vice President of Global Talent Development. And so that means that during the day, I care for and have accountability for developing our talent globally, which is about 800,000 people who wear a Marriott name badge across our 30 brands from all over the world. I'm a proud Korean American, raising two Korean American kids. And so the topic of developing talent, who I'm raising, who I'm developing, is something that is near and dear to me, both personally and professionally. And so I'm excited for the conversation.
Fantastic. It's great to have you, Jessica. Jessica Kung, you're next.
Hi, everyone. Jessica Kung. I'm currently the Global COO of HR and Head of Executive Talent at Morgan Stanley. Prior to that, I was the Chief Human Resources Officer at Eaton Vance, which was a publicly traded asset management company. And I also spent 16 years at Goldman Sachs in both investment banking and in HR. Personally, I was born in China. I came to the US when I was a young child, not speaking a word of English, and had the privilege of being dual enrolled in kindergarten and first grade at the same time, which was an interesting experience. Married with two kids, live in New York. And for me, I think this topic of emerging AAPI talent is such an important one because there are unique challenges facing Asian Americans early on in their careers as they advance to the top. And I know that personally, I've always enjoyed listening to panel discussions like this one, both early on in my career and still to this day. So really happy to be here.
Thank you, Jessica. This is the first panel I've ever moderated with two panelists of the same first name. So I've agreed with the Jessicas in advance that I will be referring to Jessica Kung as JK and Jessica Lee as JL. So hopefully that works for all of you as well to know who I'm speaking to. And Vu, why don't you close things out?
Sure. Awesome. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ngoc-Vu Nguyen, or Vu for short. I am from Bank of America. I currently serve as part of the Global Diversity Inclusion Organization as part of the Global Employee Network Strategy and Management Office. At the bank, we have employee networks, which is our internal lingo for employee resource groups. We have 11 ERGs that represent 230,000 memberships worldwide, with over 360 chapters in pretty much all the regions that we do and operate and live in. And if anything, I look forward to this conversation today around emerging AAPI talent, because why? We always are continuing to show our voices, to be visible in everything that we do, and that actually also starts in the workplace. So with that, Adrian, I turn it back to you.
Thanks, Vu. So what I'm going to do for the first, call it 20 minutes here before we turn to the audience is structure the conversation around two broad topics. So one is individual leadership. What do we each as individuals do, especially those starting out in their careers or kind of in that first management level, to be as successful as possible? And then in the second half, we'll talk a little bit about what organizations need to do. What are those imperatives? But starting on individuals first, and JK, I'm going to lead with you. Something that I always hear from leaders such as yourself that are successful in their careers is the importance of sponsorship and mentors and the people that help them along the way. What's been the role of mentorship and sponsorship in your own career? And maybe if you could share a story of an individual who helped you, we can lead with that.
It's a great question. And I've been fortunate to benefit from both mentors and sponsors in my career, sometimes without me even knowing. Mentors advise and sponsors act, and you don't need a lot of mentors. You really just need a few people that you can trust and that know you well. I've been strategic about cultivating a personal board of directors that have guided me on various things throughout my career. And I've needed different things at different points in my career. And so my personal board has changed as a result. Sponsors, I think, are incredibly important. They can speak for you in the rooms that you're not in. And there are people that want to take an interest in you, who invest in you. And I'll give you an example of one sponsor, someone that I worked closely with outside of my department, was much more senior than me at the time. And he knew my work well and knew my potential well and was able to vouch for me in rooms that I wasn't a part of, and frankly spoke on my behalf at a time when I found it difficult to do so for myself. So what I would say to all of you listening is be that person that someone else wants to vouch for you, and strive to be the person that others are willing to invest in, and pay that forward when you're a more senior person yourself.
You know, Adrian, if I can add to what JK just shared, you used a word that I just want to key in on, because I think it's really important, JK, about being strategic around who you choose for that personal board of advisors, or as a mentor, or if you're able to identify someone to serve as a sponsor for you. And I think a lot of times one of the things that I have seen and experienced is, maybe not everyone approaching it with a really strategic goal of like, what am I trying to get out of the relationship? And so I love that you just used, the word strategic, because I think for myself, a learning that I got early on in my career in terms of getting the right mentor or sponsor was that I couldn't be so selfish on my own, right, around what am I going to get out of it? And that really, when I found the most effective arrangements was where I aligned myself to someone, and this may sound very simple, like in hindsight, but it was a learning for me early on around how to make sure I was aligning myself to someone where it was going to be a win-win, where there was a desire on their part to develop me. It would benefit them in some way because of the role they held, certain priorities they had for, whatever it is they did from a business perspective, but then it would also help propel me. I think sometimes, like, I've been even approached by people who want to be mentored or sponsored where, unfortunately it's like a self-centered point of view of like, here's what I need out of you, as opposed to like, here's what I bring to the table that can help you from a win-win perspective. And so that's one of the other nuggets that I think has really, been a realization for me over the years, and really help with making sure that, myself and the other person were both very grounded in terms of motives, but also expectations. And so finding that sweet spot and really being like strategic and judicious around like with whom the relationship is with has made a big difference for, myself personally.
I'd love to stay on this idea of your network and this personal board of directors, and maybe go a little off script and talk a little bit about how have the three of you thought about, the role of Asian mentors and sponsors within that network? Is it important? And I know, Vu, like, one of the reasons I run McKinsey's ERG, and one of the reasons we have the ERG is to hopefully create some of these spontaneous connections and form relationships between our members where, one person may be more junior and one person may be more senior. So maybe I'll pose the question to you, Vu, in your own experience, right? Like, is it important to have Asian mentors and sponsors?
Adrian, thank you for that question. It is important. And I think, if anything, why it builds that first initial bridge. Why? Because you and that mentor, you both identify as Asian or as AAPI, either as, as an identity or as an advocate or ally for the AAPI community. So there's already common ground on that perspective. Likewise, as you are going through the mentorship, component, as you're identifying, what do you hope to get out of it? What they hope to get out of it? What are the commonalities? What are the goals? There are relations that you can build upon just based on the common shared of identity. And if anything, the one thing I always, and maybe this is kind of unique in my perspective as well, the professional aspect is important, but to me, it's also that personal, right? So, I take an example where, I was considering a career move to Asia. I was working in New York at that time, really loved what I do. And I had an Asian mentor, she asked, Vu, what do you want to get out of it? I really think you should take this opportunity overseas. I've never been overseas. I've never been, the destination was Hong Kong. And I said, I have no clue whatsoever. I'm of Vietnamese ethnicity. I can't even speak Canto. I can't even speak Mandarin. How in the world will I survive? And, she used her personal background, as an Asian, because she was from the Hong Kong area. She was able to share that, the culture, the work culture, the personal, work-life balance over there, the people that you meet, the broad experiences, how that helped develop her, not only just personally to be a more world-renowned, knowledgeable individual, but professionally as well, building out those connections. And for me, that's what got to me, was just, here is someone, a lady who's in, very senior management level, who identifies as Asian, who is sharing to me not just, hey, you'll get a great pay bump, or, you'll get more exposure to senior leaders, but it's the personal aspect, being able to forge connections, and that, it's something to help identify and explore, in the culture that you may not probably, need to learn more in, right? We are all unique in our identities, if it's our ethnicity or whatnot, but there's so much more to learn in the AAPI space. And that's why having an Asian mentor, a sponsor, they help bridge that gap from that personal to that professional development.
I couldn't agree more, Vu. On this idea of shared experience, right? Like what you articulated was some of the real positives, people, having really positive shared cultural backgrounds, but there's also kind of the negative shared experience of, I remember after the Atlanta shootings, right, our community having to come together and just kind of be together. And there are examples in the workplace too, right? Many Asians starting out in their careers face, challenges that are different from those that are in the majority. And Jessica Lee, Jay, I'll maybe ask you the question, as you reflect on your own career, how have you remained authentic to your own identity, right? And face some of those challenges around unconscious bias or workplace discrimination?
Well, I think a simple answer for me is really just about being a bit like uncompromising in terms of like remaining authentic to who I am, and being pretty open about it, which is something that I've had to probably work on a bit, probably not my natural style, especially when I think about how I was raised and maybe some of the personality traits or demeanor or mannerisms that my parents probably wanted me to muffle a bit in order to, be fit a mold of what they wanted. So this is kind of a learned thing for me, but I think being pretty authentic and uncompromising in it has been something that I've found to be very important, but clear in my communications. So, I think just to be more specific, what I would share is that I actually tell people pretty openly that it's not my natural self to be an extrovert when I have to do things like this, where I'm speaking in broad settings. Like, I know how to turn it on, be gregarious and engaging, but like, that's not how I was raised to, speak up and be this, extroverted. And so it's not my natural self, but simply even talking to people about that and helping them understand, like, this is not my comfort zone. I've got to turn something on because the way I was raised, the way my parents might have wanted me to be is just a different person. So opening up about that and helping people see kind of like the duality, and me, sharing that in a very authentic way is something that, I have found to be, really important, and just making a difference for people to, understand a bit more about where I'm coming from.
JK, I might ask you, just on reflecting on your own experience, because I'm just thinking on back to your intro, talking about, if I recall, growing up in China and not speaking English growing up, and now working in a Western context. What's been your experience building on what JL was talking about?
Yeah, it's interesting. I wanted to go back to what you were saying earlier about the role of Asian mentors. So I actually had an Asian woman mentor who was a managing director at the time in human resources. And it was so helpful to me because we could talk about things that I just couldn't do as naturally with others. So for example, we could talk openly about perceived as smart, hardworking, quiet, and how one can shape perception, which is so important, and talk about there's not just one style of leadership that's impactful in an organization. And I found that relationship to be incredibly helpful. For me, it was interesting. I came to the U.S. when I was 6 and felt very much like an outsider. And it was interesting because later on in my life, still as a child, I actually moved to Hong Kong and lived there and went to an international school there. And in a way felt more of an outsider than I ever had in my life, even though I was in a majority Asian culture, in a majority Asian school. And so when I think about DE&I think the inclusion part is so important. And I know for all 4 of us, given our involvement in our professional roles, we're really trying to build and advance that in each of our workspaces.
And we were talking about this just before the session started, just kind of, what each of us is doing in our respective organizations. And I think those in the audience, many are starting out in their careers, but if they're attending this session, they have a passion for this topic and very soon may also be called on, right, to lead ERGs or initiatives in their companies. I have one last question. I guess I'll open it up to all 3 of you. There's this idea of the dual burden, right? Those that are coming from the minority having to kind of break the bamboo or glass ceiling, but also lead, right, in a way and pull those up behind them. And that can create, a challenge and leads to burnout and leads to people getting disillusioned with, having to go through all of that. How have you thought through that in your own careers and, still reserving the energy to create space for others and while also, leading in your own ways? And Jill, I remember you were telling me you may be the most senior Asian person at Marriott outside of Asia, which is incredible.
Yeah. And, just to give credit, because I've got some really great and talented colleagues. And I think I'm probably one of the most senior most Asians outside of Asia. There's a few of us. But, it's interesting when you bring up the idea of dual burden, because I think for me, there is like a realization that I had to come to at a certain point. And it was actually fairly recently when I was asked to take on the role I'm in now, where someone actually just said to me, like, you don't get it. And it was, I'm so thankful this person said it to me. They said, you don't get it. You're actually aspirational. So when people are wanting to spend time with you, when they're engaging with you, when they're wanting to have coffee with you, yes, it may feel like people are pulling on you a lot, but it's because you're aspirational. And it was I don't say that to, sound, full of myself by any means, but it was actually a really humbling moment for someone to say that to me, because I think maybe there were times in my own past where I felt like, okay, I'm being chosen to do something because I'm a token. I'm like the Asian person they want to have, so they have diversity in the mix. And I think when someone put it in the context of like it being aspirational, and I started really just thinking about the importance of course, representation. I think it's just really put me in a different headspace and mindset around a bit of a responsibility that I have, to be honest. And so, the pull and some of the burden that may create is real, but I truly take to heart like the concept of, being aspirational or the responsibility that I bear. And, it's kind of a joke that I've made over the years, but it's really true. Like when I was growing up, I thought I wanted to be in journalism because I had Connie Chung as a role model. And for anyone that watched Channel 1 growing up, I'll give a shout out to Lisa Ling, where I saw her, in my school on the TV. And so there were people like that I saw, and I was like, oh, like I can do that. I can be that. And I use that as a joke, but I think it's really real for me, and kind of a full circle moment where I think it's a responsibility. I think as a parent now, it's become even more of a responsibility where I feel a great sense of this is my job, it's my duty. And, I just have to find the right balance. And thankfully, I'm married to someone who, helps me, figure out the balance between the two of us so that I can take these things on. But, of course, there's tactical things like I love me a good headspace moment and trying to really center myself and practice mindfulness and things of that sort, because I think it really helps from a burnout perspective. But it's a responsibility I take, tremendously as something that I got to tackle and do.
Vu or JK, anything you'd add?
Yeah, I can. Sorry.
Go ahead, JK.
I was just going to say, pressure is a privilege, and I feel really fortunate to be in the role that I'm in the visible role that I was in before as well. And similar to what JL said, sometimes when people refer to me as a senior person, it surprises me because I still see myself sometimes as the 21-year-old investment banking analyst who is unsure of herself. But I embrace the role that I'm in, and I'm proud that I'm someone that people can look up to, whether it's women or Asians, and see. It's interesting because my 12-year-old son recently said to me, if I grow up to be an actor one day, and I thought to myself, oh my goodness, where's this conversation going? He said he could see himself being Shang-Chi. And I thought to myself, you know what, it's great that he sees an Asian role model on screen, but it's also sad that there are very few. So if I can be the Shang-Chi of whatever, fill in the blank for others, it's a great thing.
I love that idea
and
of being a Shang-Chi. Go ahead,
and to JK's and JL's point, the one thing around dual burden is actually something that is unique, I think, just recently. So I was actually speaking to the ladies before this call that, currently I sit in the D&I space. I've been with the bank, actually, it'll be 14 years in June. 13 years has always been in finance. And so all of my folks who are, on this call right now, I'm sure that most of you, or I would say a big majority of you guys, are working in the financial services field. You're good with numbers, you're very analytical. And when I actually made this jump into the D&I space literally about 10 to 11 months ago. Why is actually because of the work that I did in the Asian ERG here at the bank. And the dual burden component comes in by the fact that looking at these wonderful ladies on the panel and, a lot of the people that I know of, we have AAPI talent in HR. We have AAPI talent in HR that focuses on like talent retention, bringing in talent, kind of your really core components. And of course, all the work that they do are going to, give a lens towards D&I. But when I look at myself as an Asian male who is solely focused on D&I. I don't even touch the talent retention part. I don't even touch, bringing in, folks. I work, my focus is on ERGs, but when I think about just D&I in general, look around you, look around all your LinkedIn profiles and everything. I'm sure you will find Asians in HR. I asked the audience, how many Asians do you know in HR? Solely focuses on D&I and are male. And to me, I came in, as sales was like as a privilege in finance because I had a lot of my friends who identified as Asian that, I felt like it was at home. But now in this space, I feel like I'm starting all over again. But that's just what motivates me. Why? Because I want to bring more people in. I think one of our goals here at the bank is ensuring that the representation that we have at the bank echoes the communities that we work and live in. And I want to make sure that, one day when I eventually leave the D&I space or leave the HR space or even banking in general, I can look around on my LinkedIn profiles or even to Adrian or to the JK and JLs and say, hey, I've got a ton of Asians that are not only just in HR, but they're in D&I and they cover the broad spectrum of gender as well. And I think to me that's just it was so profound when I literally had to take a glance back and say, holy moly, I can't find any other Asian males that are in D&I. And it's my job now to ensure that I identify, mentor, and sponsor the folks who want to come into this space, be it male or female. Because why? I think Asian representation means a lot. And that's something that we all strive to work for.
I love that point, Vu. And just to connect two ideas, like you are in some ways are the Shang-Chi of the DEI space. And I'm going to stay with you for a moment because this is a great pivot to the second topic that I want to talk about, which is what organizations can do. And I mean, you're 12 months into this journey. What have you learned on what ERGs need to do to better support people in our community?
Yeah. So I think I first have to give kudos to the team at Bloomberg. I went to their session around AAPI ERGs, and we had a really great conversation. I'm going to echo the same messages that we talked about there. I think ERGs, first and foremost, they work to promote that inclusive environment at the grassroots level, right? So everything that we hear from top of the house, the things that we spout, the benefits of D&I, our goals for D&I, where do you directly get that impact from? Where do you actually feel and see it? It's the work that you do in ERGs. And so ERGs has to promote that inclusive environment for their membership to number one, allow the opportunities to share these stories, the stories of professional development, rising through the ranks, or, moving industries. It's learning about having a safe platform to talk and express, to people and help educate others about, maybe my ethnicity, why we have these heritage months, why do we, celebrate Lunar New Year. It's about creating connections and programming that uniquely relates to the AAPI individual and allies and advocates of the AAPI community. I think at times we tend to be, focused on, hey, I want to grow me. I want to grow my identity. I want to make sure that people know who I am. But true inclusion requires not only, targeting people who identify like us, but our allies and our advocates. Why? Because we continue that cycle of mentoring and sponsorship. And I think also the last thing, it's getting senior level buy-in. ERGs are the most impactful kind of first step for senior management leaders to come in and say, hey, what can I do? What my influence? How can I support your ERG or the missions of that ERG? And I think if anything, that grassroots level then moves up to your regions, moves up to the enterprise. And I'll give you some examples here. Like, at the bank in 2021, given everything that was going on, our senior leaders were front and foremost, in front of all of our ERG members and our ERGs as a whole. We conducted over 350 plus courageous conversations on topics around racial and social justice, around, what can we do as, fellow human beings to help people who are underrepresented, to say that they are visible, that they have a voice, that we can say, I see you. I see you and I want to help you. I want to help you with your representation. I want to help you with your message, your voice. Senior level buy-in is that's one of the biggest things that ERGs can help play. And if we can show that impact, quantify it, present it, and ensure also not internally but externally to the communities, working with nonprofits, to ensure that our messaging is consistent, that people know that we are making a difference, putting our money where our mouth is and investing in nonprofits, in minority communities. That is something that ERGs here at the bank, and I would assume all the ERGs here, that's what we can do and want to do. So I say, in closing, Adrian, it's a lot to go on, but at the front and foremost, ERGs are the grassroots level to move representation, to let our voices be heard all the way up to the top. And it's the top that helps push that envelope forward.
It's so important, Vu. And in a moment, I'd love to actually hear from JL and JK if they have other reflections based on, at Marriott and MS, like what else they're seeing. But I would also remind you all that you can submit questions via Hopin. I'd love to get to some of those in a couple minutes. But JK, JL, any reflections?
One thing that I was just reflecting on as Vu was speaking, just to use some of your words, you referenced and used the word ally, and, you use the phrase, which I think is so powerful around, seeing other people. And, one of the things that, I've just been thinking a bit about is, the role that we can also play, whether it's through an ERG, whether it's through just the work we do day in and day out, in terms of being an ally to other, underrepresented or other marginalized groups. And I think particularly, in the past few years, it's something that I've really, I think been confronted with and been introspective about is around, how to really stand in solidarity with others who in some cases have been marginalized, maybe more egregiously or even more intentionally or systematically. And so the notion of like, how do we be, also an ally to other groups is something that I think is a sense of responsibility and just a bit of reflection also that is at times needed, because I think that it's easy for us to put a focus on, and we rightfully should, around anti-Asian hate or other issues that are salient, that are real. But the idea and role that we can also play as allies to others and to stand in solidarity with others is something that I couldn't help but think about when you were talking, Vu. I think it's really powerful.
Yeah, that idea resonates a lot. Oh, please, JK, go ahead.
I was just going to say from my side, when I was listening to your comments, we talk about Asians and Asian ERGs, and a single story can't be told about Asians in America. We're such a diverse group, maybe different from some other ERGs in that respect. We span 20 plus countries, 40 plus languages, a really wide spectrum of different educational and economic attainment. And I think for companies to truly advance racial equity, they need to start by understanding the lived experiences of its employees and recognizing the unique challenges that each group and subgroup faces. And so for Morgan Stanley specifically, I'm really proud of how the firm has taken a multifaceted approach in really driving their DE&I strategy. And it's really around three pillars. It's around workforce, so driving workforce diversity, society, so investing in underserved communities, and marketplace, enhancing engagement with diverse-led businesses. When all the unfortunate AAPI hate crime incidents came about, the firm took some immediate action and, around the issue of physical safety by conducting some bystander intervention training, providing travel stipends for its employees. But it's also working to develop our AAPI colleagues through leadership acceleration programs and reaching out to community partners and partner organizations to discuss matters of importance to our community. For example, this year, they meaning Morgan Stanley, is one of a few sponsors of this think tank Kwok study on Asians in America, which actually will explore the workplace experiences of AAPI individuals. So the results are coming out later this year, or early next. I think it'll be really interesting to see what it says.
Yeah, I think it's so important that we all, the three of you on the panel all work at organizations that have a platform, and for me it's really inspiring when that platform is used. And the reputation for Morgan Stanley is that good with the numbers, analytical. Why not point that towards problems in our community and use that platform to get the message out there. The other thing that really resonated with me was this idea of how diverse the community is. And this was made real for me. I'll come back to the Atlanta shootings. I know I sound like an American, but I'm actually Canadian. And growing up, I didn't know the history of Asian Americans, right? And when I looked around and talked to people and saw people in tears in that moment, because it felt like every week there was something else in the news, it didn't hit me the same way until I really, did the research myself to what has been the 90 years of history for Asians in the US. And I think for many of us at McKinsey at that time, we had a bunch of learning sessions where those people that maybe didn't grow up in the US or had come here recently from Asia, who didn't really understand why this was such a challenge, now could see it, right? And we were putting ourselves in the same shoes as our colleagues that, had grown up with this history. And same on the point of allyship, right? That's the other thing that came up in this conversation, right? I think, the silver lining of that 12-month period, with the George Floyd murder to the Atlanta shootings and everything that happened in between was, I think, for many of us in our organizations, we woke up to the fact that, this was a moment where things that we maybe weren't aware of or turned a blind eye to, we couldn't ignore anymore, right? And in some ways coming out of that, our ERGs can form a little bit of that connective tissue and provide that education to both people within the community and then, Vu, to your point, right, to allies outside as well. I'm I guess open it up to all three of you and come back to my idea, JK. You brought up this the Shang-Chi idea. And for a while I was using the phrase crazy rich Asians because that was the idea in media. But there's a moment that I feel like we're living in, right, where we might be hitting an inflection point where there are more conversations like this. There's more representation in spheres outside of business. Is the same thing going to happen in the corporate world? And are we going to start to see, maybe for the generation that's listening to this panel, a real change, right, in the next 10 to 15 years where, this kind of conversation may not be as necessary, right, when they are in your positions? What are your reflections on if we're living in a moment like that?
I'm cautiously optimistic. I think, the unfortunate violence against our community has dovetailed with more prominence and representation in movies, in media, et cetera. But, it's interesting, by 2055, I think Asian Americans are projected to be the largest immigrant group in the US. So this right now is our moment. It's our moment to speak up, to support one another, to advance and rise to the top of our fields so that our future generations can prosper. I see this very much as us helping to lift up the future generations to come, just like many of our parents did for us. And so I'm cautiously optimistic that in the next decade or so, I want to see more visibility in corporations, in government, in media, you name it. And I think it's going to be possible.
I love JK's cautious optimism around it, or I interpret it as optimism. And I agree. I mean, I think that we're in this moment where there's so much promise and potential. My hope with that, though, is that, to the point earlier, and when we think about Asian Americans in the US, it's not a monolith. I mean, you have so much diversity within it. And you also have a lot of disparity within the Asian American community in the US. And so I think with my optimism probably comes this desire for us to make sure, though, that we're even looking inward within the community to look at where you do have disparity, and that we, are looking broadly on how to look out for our community, because I think it's easy to, broad brush strokes around the community. And I think that there's a lot of opportunity. And then beyond that, just kind of to the earlier part of the conversation, how do we really do right by, other underrepresented or marginalized groups that are not Asian American, but, have a bit of a shared experience and could really use that lift as well. So I'm optimistic as well, but also maybe a bit of a rallying cry for us to, really look at some of our brothers and sisters and say, like, how do we help others as we're, pulling ourselves up? So I think it's bright, though.
I'm going to be the crazy person on my side. I'm crazy optimistic. I think it's always good to be careful. That's the I would say the Asian in us, right? We've got to make sure we take calculated risks. But I'm just crazy optimistic, and this is the why. Our voices are being heard. They're being heard from the neighborhoods, in the boardrooms, even up to the top levels of government. The actions that we are taking are now being felt worldwide, not just U.S. centric, right? When let's move it to the corporate world. When you see senior management teams, when you see your leadership, when you see the people, the teams around you, the associates around you, and you see and you can talk to them and these people identify either as AAPI or allies or advocates of our community, that's a step towards progress. And I want to quote some stats here. And I know this is subjective in the terms of B of A, but we announced in our AAPI fact sheet, our US-centric workforce, 13% of our US-based workforce identify as Asian. Since 2015, our representation of Asian teammates at the top management levels increased over 24%. But at the executive senior level, 43%. I'm optimistic. Why? That's a change that's going. That's double-digit numbers, not single-digit, double digits. And so I leave it in this kind of closing that I share the sentiment that all of our leaders, and probably you all on the panel watching this, know we are the change that we want people to see. But gosh, there's so much more to do. So much more to do for us individually and collectively as an AAPI community. So I close it with that. Back to you, Adrian.
I've been told by our team that I might be okay going a little bit over the 217 end, and almost as if the audience heard my call for questions, a bunch of them have come in. And one of them is directed to you, JL, because you were talking a little bit about being authentic to yourself. And an audience member wanted to know, as you were moving up in your career, did you find yourself having to change the way in which you behave to fit in with your peers? And the specific example this audience member asked was like, do I have to pretend to like sports if I don't like sports to talk with people who like sports?
Oh my gosh, I love this question so much because, what's interesting is I think there are moments where I've been very stubborn around, I don't like sports. I'm not going to talk sports. I'm just not going to do it. And I've been very vocal about that with teams, with leaders. And like, I think even my own boss today. So it's like, I'm going to talk about sports for a minute. Just give me a moment. And so I personally have tried to stay authentic to myself, but I also recognize there are times where knowing some things is also going to help you build a relationship. And so, every once in a while, I'll pull out a little bit that I might know about a certain sport or a team or a current event. And so I say that all to say that for me, it's a bit of a balance around also just reminding people around we don't all have the same interests and we all may be paying attention to different things and that there's value in that. But from a relationship building perspective, I think it helps to know a thing or two. And so that's how I've personally navigated that.
Vu, there's a question here from an audience member for you as well, which is, we talked about building connections within your company or outside. Any specific advice for doing that in a virtual world?
Oh my gosh. I think to me, when we made that pivot in 2020 for all of us, where we actually had to meet virtual, I think it gave us more opportunity to actually go out and meet folks. But I'm sure this audience member is saying, oh gosh, I'm in the safety of my own room and I can only talk to that person visually, but what can I do? I think if anything, it's continuing to be yourself, to be authentic in the conversation and making those connections, right? It can be on the topic of sports. It can be the topics of Korean dramas, right? Anything, but really, I think it's being intentional with the person you're meeting, be it virtually or in person. But I think in virtual, you have a little bit of give. Why? Because you don't have to actually, if you need notes in front of you, right? Or if you want to make yourself presentable at home, you feel more comfortable in your own space. So take that in. Make that you, and allow that to be your platform to engage and to connect with that person through the webcam, which I'm doing right now, in front of you all. So just, if anything, be intentional in your message, be authentic, and just, take it all in. Because at the end of the day, you've got to give yourself some grace, because I'm sure the person behind the camera is just as nervous as you are.
And I would say also for everyone in the audience, channel Vu's energy and just that exuberance, because that never hurts either. I have one last question. I want to pose it to all three of you. And just very briefly, what is one piece of advice, maybe something that we haven't talked about today, that you'd want to share with all of those listening today? Maybe we'll go JK first, then JL, and then Vu, you can wrap things up.
Sure, yeah, I'm happy to start. I think the one piece of advice, if I had to pick one thing, is I talked a little bit earlier about perception and how that's really important, I think, especially for Asian Americans early on in their career, and perception can be shaped. So I would say, think about 3 adjectives, 3 things, 3 ways in which you'd like to be viewed, and that are also aligned with your organization's needs, and act consistently with that in mind. And I think you can start to shape other people's perceptions of you.
Well, Adrian, I can't say channel Vu's energy, because that might be like my new mantra. I'm going to try to bottle it up, and I think it's infectious. So I love it. But, I'm going to go with something simple, which is just around, I think it's really easy if you grew up like I did on, wanting to default to a place of humility. And I think humble is a trait that I really love. However, I just don't know that we each own our talents and own our power enough. And I think it's really easy to be afraid of it, or to not want to be too boisterous or too proud or too arrogant with it. But so I think simply to own your talents and own your power, not be afraid of it is what I would say.
I would say this, and I would say anything channeling this energy, but it's really be proactive in your journey, professionally, but I also say personally as well. Take those risks, take those opportunities that will grow you, right? Learn what truly defines your life. Of course, know your limits, but at the same time, be unforgiving in informing others the true value you bring to the table. Because why? You have already earned that seat at the table. So why not be proactive and go all in? So with that, Adrian, I turn it back to you.
Thank you, Vu. And thank you, Vu, JL, JK, for being here. I learned a lot in this conversation. We really appreciate you making the time to share these perspectives. Thank you, everyone in the audience, for taking the time to join today's session. Thank you, the Aegis Society, for hosting it. And with that, I'm going to call this session to a close and turn things back over to the organizers.